Recording in progress.
I'm going to resume the recording, and we've got about 10 people so far, so please just make sure that your audio is muted. If you'd like to leave your video up, that's totally fine. You don't have to. Debating, I might actually try mine without video this time. That way you just get the full PowerPoint. So feel free, I have an alarm set towards the end of the class for time for questions, but if something pops up and you have a question that you don't get a chance to have answered, feel free to email me. And it looks like I am recording, so we're all good to go there. Let me just turn off my screen. Everybody can hear me okay? Thumbs up. Sweet. Oh, it's so good to see all you guys. You just look at you all here for a second. Oh, love it. I'm really excited for this class. You know, with the poison path, like we typically get, you know, caught up in a lot of the psychedelic aspect and the entheogenic aspect. And, you know, while that's important, definitely, you know, there's a lot that we can unpack when we look at the poisonous aspect of these plants. And that's what really initially attracted me to them was, you know, the fact that they're poisonous, they're scary, they're kind of, you know, ostracized and set apart from all of the other herbs, the healing herbs, you know, so they have a lot in common with, you know, sort of my own experience and how I've sort of dealt with humans and society, and, you know, sort of feeling like an outsider. You know, that's really the way these plants have kind of been treated. But they definitely have something special to offer, just like we all do. So this is a class on poison magic. I'm not trying to glorify homicidal poisoning or poisoning your husband or anything like that, but it is a part of the history, and that's what we're going to be looking at is some of the history that poison has had, how it's influenced society and culture and religious ideas, and really played a big role in human development. The main kind of focus is poison as sort of a magical concept and poison's connection to witchcraft, and that sort of gets you into some of my thought process behind some of my formulations and some of my amulets and ritual tools and things that you'll notice in my writing. Is that I'm very interested and very focused on sort of the chthonic, darker spiritual aspect of a lot of these plants that allow us to reach some of those deeper places of ourselves and deeper places in the earth, in the underworld. You know, not so much about celestial beings and, you know, this sort of expansive enlightenment as they are about really going down into that deep sort of concentrated core to get whatever insights from that, but I sort of digress there. So you'll get some insight into my train of thought. But starting with the history of poison, we'll just sort of look at it through some different cultures' points of view to develop a better understanding just for how mankind has viewed the idea of poison. You know, it started out as a very important tool for improving hunting. It was mainly what it was used for, the discovery of poison-tipped arrows for bringing down large game in a more efficient, safer manner. But then as society sort of became more civilized and we became less nomadic and started to settle down in cities and develop governments, that's when we sort of see this more subversive, homicidal poisoning kind of a concept where it becomes used more for assassination, for overthrowing different governments, and for especially financial gain and taking out familial rivals. It has been, you know, super important in herbal medicine. So some of our most important medicines that we still use today actually come from plant toxins or plant alkaloids. So we'll learn that while poison can mean toxic, it can mean deadly, it also means chemically potent. It also means medicinal. There's a lot of other things kind of wrapped up in this word poison. It's brought us a lot of advances in toxicology and neurochemistry too. So the isolation of these alkaloids and studying what they do on the human body has led to the discovery of important neurotransmitters and just working with toxicology and pathology in autopsy, forensics, all of that. And then we'll also look at its ethnobotanical role. It's especially used in religious ceremonies and is really deeply woven into the cultures of places like Africa, Asia, South America. But ethnobotanicals and poison plants in general have really been demonized by the Western world. Really all throughout our history, kind of from the onset of Christianity and sort of moving away from some of those more shamanic practices, we see a lot of the propaganda sort of surrounding these plants, and that sort of is where their connection to witchcraft kind of stems from as well, as far as diabolical witchcraft in the Middle Ages. They can also give us new perspectives in medicine and spirituality. So just looking at some of the history, starting with some of the most ancient history of poison in general, brings us to the Scythians. The Scythians are a really interesting group of people. They were a nomadic group in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, and they were very much feared for their skill in battle. So just knowing that the Scythians were going to be there would be enough to really strike fear in the enemy and kind of give them an advantage. They were feared not only for their combat ability, but also for the fact that they employed sorcerers. They were feared for their witchcraft and their sorcery, kind of known as this group of people that sort of delved in the dark arts and had this magical sort of support behind their regime. So that's an interesting connection right off the bat that we have between these people that were known for sorcery and also known for their combat. One of the reasons that they were so well known for combat was because they used a special poison called Scythicon. Scythicon was developed and named for the Scythians, and it's a really nasty sounding type of a poison that's actually created by taking a bunch of poisonous creatures like snakes and scorpions and spiders and kind of putting them all in this crucible and just sort of letting them fight it out to the death and then remain in there. And then they would be allowed to putrefy those venoms and other nasty things sort of mixing and mingling together, and then other things like human excrement and juice from poisonous plants would be added to that, and that's what they would actually dip their arrows in. And we see a picture of the arrows there to the right, which used a special tri-blade design, which made them especially hard to remove from the armor, or to pierce the armor, but to remove from the skin. So they were really nasty, really advanced armor-piercing kind of a weapon, which was pretty scary for, Bronze Age. Another interesting little side to the poison arrowheads is that they were actually made with a copper alloy that sometimes contained arsenic. So you'll get these arrowheads, and they have just a little bit different patina on them than some of the other ones, and that's the arsenical copper. So not only would they be dipped in this poison formula, but they would also, the metal itself would be toxic as well. And we do have some connection between the Scythians and shape-shifting, cannabis cults, and other things like that as we get into the more psychedelic side of it. So they're a really interesting group of people to look at when it comes to the history of poisons, witchcraft, and entheogens. But moving on to ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians were aware of a number of ethnobotanicals that they used in religious ceremony and in medicine, including cannabis, poppy, mandrake, but really just kind of cutting to the chase to the poisonous part, going right to Cleopatra, who was thought to have killed herself with poisonous snakes. This is an example of sort of how modern toxicology has given us some retrospect on, the actual death and what we understand now about how different toxins work and different symptoms to look for. It's actually unlikely that she killed herself using these snakes, but actually with a formula of aconite, opium, and hemlock. So this would have allowed her to slip more peacefully into death, as opposed to going through the contortions and seizures, paralysis associated with the neurotoxins in snake venom. So this is probably the more likely route that she took, and she did already have an interest in poisons. She owned a cosmetics company on the Dead Sea where she would have had access to all of these different heavy metals that would have been used in cosmetics, as well as different botanical ingredients. And that's also our first female poisoner. So that will be kind of a recurring theme throughout this as well, that we'll talk a little bit more about later, but just the connection between women and the knowledge of poisonous plants. Then we go into ancient Greece, where we see some of our first modern words pertaining to toxins and poison and things like that. So looking at how they understood these different words shows a little bit more nuance to the concept of poisonous plants than them just strictly being deadly. The word toxin and toxic comes from the Greek word toxikon or toxikos. This pertains to poison arrows. You'll also see this root word in the Latin nomenclature for the yew tree, taxus. Similar derivative root. Yew tree is also toxic and was used to actually construct bows and arrows. So kind of coming full circle there. We see poison being mentioned in the Odyssey as well as the Iliad, where we get to meet some different figures, Circe, Medea, some different figures that are sort of patrons of the poison path. Socrates is one of the earliest and most famous deaths by poisoning. He was sentenced to death by drinking poison hemlock. So this at the time was actually seen as being a very sort of humane means of execution. It wasn't really nasty or bloody or messy. Basically, the person slowly becomes paralyzed, they lose their speech, sight, and die by respiratory failure. There's no antidote for hemlock poisoning. When we look at hemlock in magical practice, hemlock is really, really good for cord cutting. It's great for removing a specific person or a specific influence, or sort of distancing yourself from a negative person or influence. So it's really great for, breakup spells, getting over people, sort of moving on. It can also be employed as a hexing herb. So we can use it to cut someone off from something. It works as sort of an energetic asphyxiation, which we're getting from the sympathetic effects of the actual physical asphyxiation that occurs from poisoning. So it does sort of have that vampiric effect of cutting someone off from some type of something that they're desiring for whatever reason. And they can also be used in anti-love spells. So at the bottom, I have the words Phytonica, Chthonios, just mentioning the theme that a lot of these plants are connected to the underworld, which is where all of the ancestral wisdom is. It's where all of the spirits of the dead were believed to go. So it's where we're sort of seeking this deeper sort of collective consciousness wisdom through these plants associated with the underworld. Moving into ancient Rome, they saw themselves as being a little bit more refined than the ancient Greeks. So not so much in battle, but poisoning sort of moved into the home and into the Senate. Murdering family members became a mainstream practice among Roman nobility. It was used for the advancement of social status, the removal of competition. One famous poisoner was Agrippina. She was actually once the Empress of Rome and paved the way for Nero to become emperor using poison. She did not do it herself, but she hired out. We have Locusta, who was a Gaulish poisoner for hire. So she would have had that Celtic origin. She also helped to poison Emperor Claudius. She was scapegoated and imprisoned and actually let back out and then went on to help Nero poison Britannicus. So she was a very successful poisoner, very good at what she did. And it was through some of her crimes or her achievements that a lot of the early laws regarding poison came around. So in the ancient world, we had to, first define sort of what poison was and what poison wasn't when it came to, different medicinal herbs and religious herbs. So looking through some of these early laws, especially the Lex Cornelia, that deals with a lot of our sort of earliest ideas about poisonous plants. And then we also start to see sort of that connection between poison plant knowledge and malefic witchcraft, where we see the terms beneficium and maleficium used together almost synonymously. And that's the first time we kind of see that. So it gives us an insight into this sort of early thought process on toxins and contagion and disease. So it's just sort of this idea that some objects, or in this case plants or substances, can be so contaminated with this sort of evil power that they're actually able to kill or curse from a distance. So we see things like the evil eye and magical darts, which we'll talk more about towards the end. But these plants themselves, or these substances themselves, actually sort of giving off this malefic force simply because they have that ability to end life. We also see the use of infectious powders that can be used to poison through the feet. When we look into American folk magic, hoodoo, laying tracks, gopher powder, things like that, is actually a type of magical poisoning. So we get some interesting insight into this concept of miasma, or poisonous air, which is kind of like a negative energy or a bad chi. So it's just sort of the way of starting to think about, it as this sort of living sort of force. Poison was seen as, sort of a contaminant, just like anything that could cause death or disease. So anything that was connected to death, in close proximity to the living, would cause that kind of contamination. And a lot of these attributes were equated to this evil power, and we see these plants becoming associated with the devil, as if they've somehow escaped the reach of God. So as we move into the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, we see sort of belief being taken out of the Romans' book and poison being elevated to this very, sort of aristocratic art form of social advancement. So death by poison was a very real and common threat during this time period, especially with the development of arsenic. So this would have been done by Arab alchemists, where they would have distilled and extracted it into its odorless, colorless form, which would have made it the perfect secret weapon to take out an enemy in close proximity, because there would have been no way to really detect for it at the time. And symptoms of arsenic poisoning would have just really mirrored the symptoms of a terminal illness. So we really see a spike in poisoning, with the development of arsenic into that crystalline form. Renaissance poisoners proliferated, especially in Italy and France. It was very in vogue in those areas, possibly due to just a couple of aristocratic families that sort of just created this fashion of poisoning. So it's interesting that we see it more in these areas than we do, in other parts of Europe. Not to say that, poisoning didn't occur in those places, because it definitely did, and it was very widespread. But Italy and France are kind of known for poison. In addition to that, these aristocratic families also had a habit of frequenting fortune tellers and magicians. So they all kind of ran in the same circle. One example in Italy is Lucrezia Borgia. She was the daughter of Pope Alexander IV. The Borgia family dominated Renaissance Italy, and they're referred to as one of Italy's first crime families. It was insinuated that they got to where they did because of murder and black magic and all of these sort of unethical things that allowed them to acquire all of their wealth. And Lucrezia, she kind of became a scapegoat for a lot of that. It was hard to believe that she was completely innocent, but there were a lot of accusations of incest, poisoning, and all of these other crimes that sort of followed her throughout her entire life. Early on, she probably was a little bit of a scapegoat, but I think there was a little bit more to it than that. It was said that she wore a poison ring to parties, where she would tip liquid arsenic into people's drinks. And like I said, accusations of murder and sexual indecency really followed her. The Borgias are known for also dabbling in the occult, which is an interesting mention there that we'll see as a recurring theme. They actually had their own poison that they were known for as well, called La Cantareia. This was used by both the Borgias and the Council of Ten, which was one of the Venetian ruling groups at the time. So government-sanctioned assassination by poisoning. There's no surviving recipes for La Cantareia, but it's likely that it contained phosphorus, lead acetate, arsenic, and some suggest cantharidine. And the famous Giulia Tofana. I'm sure you've all heard of Aqua Tofana. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you probably just think I'm crazy while I'm whispering. But Giulia Tofana, she was sort of seen as a folk hero, an early feminist. Yes, she is with us, Bailey Sarian. Also a feminist folk hero. So at this point in history, women really had very few rights. Divorce was not an option. They would be stuck in these unhappy marriages with these men and sort of be subject to all of this abuse. And a lot of it largely went unpunished. There was not really anywhere for them to turn. You can't turn to the church, because the church is going to blame it on you and take the side of, the man. But Julia comes in and takes care of at least 600 of these guys. These adulterers, abusers, just all around bad husbands. And she does this in a really, really ingenious way. And she even taught her daughters the family business. She learned her skills from working with an apothecary, and she went on to build this successful cosmetics business where some of her products were used to disguise poison. So again, we see another connection between poison and cosmetics, just like with Cleopatra. Get my slide to go. So aqua tofana, it was said that 4 to 6 drops could kill a man. It could be applied to accurately determine the time of death, so to make it resemble sort of a terminal illness where they would just waste away for a long period of time and then finally die, which was a little bit less suspect than a healthy man just dropping dead after eating dinner. That way the wife wouldn't be implicated. It started out originally as a powder. It would have been able to be disguised as, a beauty powder or fragrance powder on the vanity. And then it went into a liquid form, which was probably just a little bit more discreet, a little bit easier to use, and a little bit less detectable. So product improvement there. The symptoms of aqua tofana are consistent with arsenic poisoning. And that's likely going to be the base of it because of the time period. That's what everybody was using. That was the best route to go at the time. Other ingredients would have been belladonna, antimony, lead, and again cantharidine, which comes from an insect. So interesting, the addition of belladonna, just with the connection to dilating of the pupils for beautification. So I noticed just sort of all these abstract connections between the plants and their history, and I just think there's more there to unpack, and that's sort of what this class is all about. So just to sort of plant some of these seeds and get you guys maybe sort of thinking in the direction that I'm thinking, or maybe it's something that's already sort of been rattling around in your own mind and I'm kind of like putting some words or direction to it. I just feel like there's definitely something here that can be expanded upon. Next is Catherine de' Medici. She's another really, really interesting figure, not only because she was known for introducing poisoning to the French court single-handedly, she was also very interested in the occult and astrology. She was known for consulting fortune tellers, astrologers, clairvoyants throughout her entire life. And this is something that she was actually raised around, that her family was involved in as well. We have different rumors about participation in satanic cults and black magic and things like that, necromancy with the Medicis. So there's definitely a notable occult connection here. She actually employed Nostradamus for a time at the French court. She's one of the most famous medieval prophets. She did come under suspicion of witchcraft because she was initially unable to conceive a child. So that was sort of seen as an unnatural sort of inversion of woman's ability to give life. So being barren was a good way to get yourself accused of witchcraft. She employed Cosme Ruggieri. He was her favorite astrologer and also worked with magicians and apothecaries. So the prognostication, the fortune telling she used to kind of get the upper hand, but when she couldn't achieve what she wanted to with that, she turned to black magic and poison. This is Catherine's love talisman. It's just sort of a really interesting little silver talisman that was made for her by Ruggieri. It was said to have been smelted with metal and the blood of a human and a goat. On the left-hand side, we see one description said that it was Anubis holding up a mirror to Jupiter, but I believe it's actually Horus holding up a mirror to Jupiter, because he's got the bird beak and the bird feet. And then on the right-hand side, we have Venus. So this was actually a love talisman for her. The Affair of Poisons was another very famous sort of poison situation that led to some more laws about witchcraft and poisonous plants and things like that that took place during 17th century France, Louis XIV. This whole situation led to exposing a huge criminal underworld that was not only involved in poison, but also the occult. It's very popular in France at this time, very in fashion, spiritualism. It began with the confession of Madame de Brinvilliers. So she was accused of killing her husband and sons to get the inheritance, using what was called an inheritance powder. So it was through her initial confession that launched this really big investigation that wound up blowing up into much more than King Louis thought that it was going to be. So they're not only fortune tellers and alchemists, but also renegade priests. So priests that would have been excommunicated and still have, some type of theological background that would be useful, or even working priests that could be paid to, bless all of these magical charms, because that was a big part of, folk magic and witchcraft at the time in medieval Europe was sort of incorporating that power of the church as well. So there was actually a lot of these priests that would work as sort of backdoor magicians. There were 36 different individuals charged during the Affair of Poisons, and this included the king's own mistress. Lavoisin is one of the prominent poisoners of the time. She was involved in this case as well. She was a purveyor of poison, a sorceress, and a criminal mastermind. She did admit to selling these potions and powders, and implicated Montespan, the king's mistress. She worked in love charms and aphrodisiacs as well. So a lot of these noble women or aristocratic women, wanting to advance themselves in the French court would turn to love magic, because the easiest way for them to advance socially would be to marry up. So there was a huge market for love charms that we see in the French court that was going on alongside all of this, and that would include aphrodisiacs and intoxicants and things like that. So just real quick, bringing it back to the connection between poison and witchcraft. Poison was seen as part of the magical repertoire in the ancient world. It's by nature very secretive. Its effects are not noticed until they're absolutely apparent. So it has kind of that occult aspect to it. Generally it has to be employed in close proximity under false pretenses, meaning that poison is generally a crime of passion. It's generally committed by somebody that knows the person. It's not something that's done on impulse or, on accident necessarily. Excuse me. So it's been used by people in powerless situations, which we see that about magic and witchcraft all the time. It was a way for people that didn't have any other way to have some kind of control over their lives or have some kind of justice or protection to sort of gain that. And this was before the time of modern medicine and the development of toxicology. So before we really understood anything about pathogenic bacteria and phytotoxins and things like that, where these unseen sort of microscopic or chemical things hadn't been discovered yet. So because they were unseen, they were associated with something spiritual or something occult. So potions and talismans were very, very commonplace. Superstition was very, very high at the time. And knowledge of one would suggest knowledge of the other. So generally, we see these accusations hand in hand, one and the same. We look all the way back to the Bible and the Old Testament. Exodus 12:28, doesn't really matter. Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. The word witch, actually, if we go back to Hebrew, mechashefa, was translated to the Greek word for poisoner. So it was actually, thou shalt not suffer a poisoner to live. We have the Greek pharmakia, knowledge of pharmacon, or plants that are magical, poisonous, medicinal, all wrapped up in one. So this idea here is really the closest to sort of where we want to be when working with these plants on a magical or ethnobotanical level, is that they're simultaneously all of these things. Yes, we call it the poison path. Yes, they're poisonous plants, but they're simultaneously all of these other things as well. So it's sort of that ancient understanding of poison that we need to get back to, which is much more holistic and something that's missing in modern medicine and even the Western esoteric tradition when it comes to plant magic. So knowledge of poisons and magical ability was usually attributed to women. Knowledge of natural medicines, that sort of thing, was really just a women's realm in general in the ancient world. So when modern medicine starts to come along and we have all of these educated physicians, all of these educated male physicians that want to take over and start treating everyone for their medical needs, they begin to demonize natural medicine. They demonize the folk practices and the women, or wart-cunning women that work in these villages, in these rural areas that are the only real access to medical care. They're the ones that are now being accused of diabolical witchcraft because they don't fall in line with these educated male physicians that are now around, that are in cahoots with the church. So we really start to see just a very capitalistic, patriarchal sort of a direction that we head in there. So looking at poison as a magical concept. So it does have its own unique energy. Just like life force has its own energy, there is also an energy to death, to decay, to that cycle of sort of being broken down, starting over. That real fertile earth comes from the death of all of these other organic creatures. So it is this energetic force, very closely aligned to the energy of death. And when we think about it in energetics as far as herbal medicine, when we look at herbs that are more tonic or more healing, herbs that bring life force into the body and expand that energy, they're more celestial, they're more solar, they're just more alive for lack of a better term. Where with poisons we have more of a contraction, more of a drawing in of life force. or cutting off of life force. And this is kind of seen in their astringent qualities, their bitter qualities. The fact that they dry up all of your bodily secretions, which is a very Saturnian quality. There's very contractive. So it's just sort of a different way of thinking about that energy. Because the plants really are just sort of vehicles for these different spiritual energies, spiritual forces that they've kind of become attached to over the millennia. So death brought about by unseen forces was seen as very, very suspicious. So we have things like the evil eye, beliefs about disease, plague, pestilence. There are spirits associated with all of these forces. When we go back into earlier times, so spirits of death and disease that would need to be placated or satiated so that we could have a fertile crop, or make sure that no children died that year. These spirits were just as important as the celestial healing deities of abundance and things like that. So we see that importance in creation myths as well throughout the world. Poison plays a role in some creation myths. So it is a very primordial, sort of elemental force. And to better understand this force, because it is kind of abstract and connecting a lot of different things, we'll be looking at different spirits and concepts associated that will kind of fill in some of these blanks and give you a better feeling for the nuances of the energy and the different ways that it can sort of be directed in magical practice. So we'll be building a Pandora's box of magical correspondences. Does anybody have any questions so I can breathe for a second? I know I talk really fast. Am I talking too fast for anyone? All right, so going back to ancient mythology, kind of looking at some of the different spirits associated with the themes that we're working with. Sumerian mythology, 500 BCE, Sumerian tablets mention Gula. Gula is a deity of witchcraft, also an underworld goddess. She goes by another name, Ninkarak. She's depicted on the right here. We see her with a crescent moon above her, also with a dog down beside her. Looks like someone's bringing her some herbs as an offering or something along those lines, but there's an interesting connection between the crescent moon, because we have that high priestess tarot imagery, and then also the dog, which we have associated with healing, but more importantly, the goddess Hecate. So I'm just kind of pointing out like some little details that will be like little pop-up recurring themes here. So not only was Gula a great healer, she was also capable of cursing wrongdoers, and she did this with poison herbs. So the inscription about Gula reads, Gula, the woman, the mighty one, prince of all women, his seed with a poison not curable, without issue, in his body may she place. So that sounds like a petition for a curse or a hex or something not good. So playing into that ability to kill or to cure, which are often one and the same. We even see that in modern medicine. Our vaccines, they will contain, the disease or the DNA of the disease itself. So while it's healing us, it's also got that little seed in there of that darker, contrary kind of component. So looking at other spirits of healing and disease, we see as well that there is this twofold nature. Babalu Aye, or Omolu, is an Orisha of the Yoruba people. He is the god of contagion and disease, but also of health and healing. So we see him depicted in syncretic traditions as Lazarus, who was cured from leprosy. On the right there, he's got two dogs. Another recurring theme here, dogs sort of being allies to mankind, representing that healing energy, but also sort of as messengers between the worlds. He can be called upon to ease transition into death, to help heal the sick. He's depicted as sort of a divine plague doctor, but also has that capability of punishing wrongdoers through disease and through illness. So I'm trying to point out that where there is death and where there is disease, where there is poison, there is also a lot of potential, especially if you're working, a more chthonic type of a path, which is basically the focus of a lot of working with a lot of these plants, at least for me personally, is sort of connecting with some of those energies that we don't typically get to connect with. In India, we see the term Visha, as mentioned in the Rig Veda. This is an early Sanskrit word meaning poison, but it refers to poisons that produce ecstasy. So we have this concept of intoxication. So while it is introducing a toxin into the body, we're doing it for a favorable outcome, which people do on a daily basis. Shiva is one of the deities connected to poison. He is not just a god of poison, but he is a god of poison. It is connected to the creation myth, the holy cow being formed in the primordial ocean, the creation of the immortal nectar. We have the development of this other substance that is poisonous and dangerous. And in the myth, all of the devas, all of the ashiras are afraid, it's going to be the end of the world. They run to Brahma. Brahma's like, I can't help you. Go ask Shiva. And Shiva, he's got it, and he drinks all of the poisonous liquid, which turns him blue. In another telling of the tale, his partner Parvati chokes him to try and keep the poison from spreading to the rest of his body. And so he's depicted with a blue throat. So this blue color that we see him with is because of this act of consuming all of that primordial poison to save the other deities. This is where aconite gets its color. The myth says that when he drank the poison, some of it spilled. And that little bit of poison is what went on to sort of envenom all of the other poison plants, especially aconite, which has typically the blue flowers when we're talking about this myth. Not only aconite, but datura, or thornapple, is also associated with Shiva, being left on his shrine, made into garlands, things like that. The Agori, they are a type of yogi or a type of ascetic priest or practitioner that practices chthonic shamanism or goetic shamanism, where we're connecting with the spirits of the dead, the underworld spirits, the spirits of the earth, through enacting different taboos and ingesting different potentially toxic substances, or spending time in the cemetery or in proximity to death. That's sort of the crux of their practice. And that is kind of in effect a lot of the poison path, poison magic, aside from the the more psychedelic entheogenic aspect, is sort of connecting with these more chthonic energies. The Agori will actually consume Aconitum ferox, which is a type of wolfsbane, mixed with cannabis, poppy, consume datura metal. And they do that for their entheogenic purposes, to connect with Shiva, to connect to these spirits. Just a little note on the poison itself, hala hala. That is the name of the poison that was churned up from that primordial ocean. It's literally translated to a black mass or a time puzzle. So I thought that was a really interesting translation that we have as a byproduct of this sort of elixir of immortality, is this black mass time puzzle. And I'm just like, that sounds a lot like antimatter. So it's just sort of the opposite of creative energy. It's the opposite of the Big Bang. It's harmful to the humans and the gods. So that's kind of an interesting translation there. And pictured on the right, we have Shiva eye agates, named after the god Shiva. Agate is actually used to prevent poisoning as a protective charm. Interesting concept there. All the way over to Norse mythology, Norway, Iceland, Scandinavia. We also have this concept of aether or venom. This was a generative substance that was responsible for all life. So again, we have that sort of dualistic concept of this deadly, deadly poison, but it's actually responsible for creating life. So the story is that sparks from Muspelheim, the realm of fire, combined with ice from Niflheim, the dark realm of ice, and they created this aether, this fluid, which was what constructed the body of Ymir, and Ymir is the world giant. Aether was also said to be the blood inside Jormungandr, so the world serpent, the Ouroboros, holding the ocean together. So it was a very, very powerful, very, very dangerous substance, kind of the equivalent to like the Greek petrichor, the blood of the gods. It's capable of creating immortality, but it's also capable of causing death. This word is found in the modern Icelandic word for poison, aether, which I'm probably not saying either one of those right, but it is a primordial creative and destructive power. I found that really interesting, looking at two separate mythologies that are quite different, having maybe similar Indo-European roots going way, way back, but both having this sort of interesting concept around this venomous byproduct during creation. So poison in magic. So now that we kind of talked a little bit about the history of poison and sort of understood its influence, and just kind of explored that a little bit. Now we'll sort of look into more of the practical side of it, actually using it in magical practice, not so much for its entheogenic effects or its mind-altering effects, but utilizing that poisonous energy to a magical end. So we'll go over sympathetic magic, talk a little bit more about poison as a magical force or an energy, and then get into some specific different types of magical practice. Just some real good stuff there. So correspondence is important. I think symbolism and mythology are very important. It's always been sort of a main area of interest for me. I think that when we study mythology, we're able to sort of internalize some of the symbolic associations and build our symbolic vocabulary, which gives us a much sort of more diverse and rich toolkit to pull from, when we're choosing magical ingredients. So the first correspondence to think about is that poisonous plants are ruled by Saturn. So anything that Saturn would be associated with could be achieved with a poisonous plant. So these are going to be hidden qualities, the occult, things that are related to the underworld, the dead, ancestors, of course, binding, banishing, protective magic, that sort of thing. And we know Saturn also relates to karma or life path, different things like that. Saturn is also going to be the planet that's, of course, the most associated with witchcraft. There's a lot to unpack with the connections of Saturn to the witch father and horned god and things like that. But Saturnian herbs are our allies, and there's a lot of different reasons for that, and that's like a whole another separate class in itself. Sympathetically, looking at poison and its secretive nature, we can use it in workings for concealment, secrecy, deception, creating illusions. There's a lot of different avenues that we could go with that, using that secretive effect of Saturnian herbs. So whether it's to, hide a working from someone else if we don't want it traced back to us, or to sort of use it maybe as more of a protective mechanism where, you would rather just go unnoticed than, set up all of these walls and all of these weapons and all of these signs that say, hey, here's my fortress. Well, sometimes stealth is a little bit safer, than creating a fortress. So protective magic with Saturnian herbs is a little bit different than, say, protective magic with martial herbs. Poison is also seductive. So we have intoxicating and aphrodisiac qualities, and just sort of that fascination of sex and death that humans just naturally have. So poison has that sort of seductive allure to it. It can be used in different enchantments, different glamours to influence the aura, perception. Of course, we have intoxication. We use it in different love formulas and compelling formulas to influence people. This would be a little bit more on the manipulative side of love magic, incorporating some of these plants. But it is a viable practice. And then, of course, we have just the simply destructive nature of poison. So using it as hexing, cursing. Medieval witches were attributed to causing plague and pestilence and killing crops and, things like that. So there's really a lot of options there too. I feel like I'm teaching you guys how to do horrible things, but it's all the interesting stuff. So poison is the power over life and death. So ancient people saw this connection. They saw this as a magical power. Ancient beliefs around venomous qualities are really interesting because they could be absorbed or transmitted through the air or through proximity, or all of these different ways that ancient people believed that poisonous creatures became poisonous or poisonous plants became poisonous. We see concepts of toxic breath and deadly stares and the basilisk and Medusa the Gorgon and different demonic spirits that, they just have this plague breath. The idea that poisonous plants grow near the entrances to the underworld or near the dead, this is sort of a chicken before the egg sort of a concept or idea, but it was believed that plants that grew near the entrance to the underworld would feed on the energies of the underworld, and that would influence them and change them, and they would become, these dark chthonic poisonous plants, things like asphodel, aconite, hemlock, hellebore, growing in proximity to the dead even, and taking on some of those qualities. So, the yew tree being planted in graveyards and things like that. So it was believed that they actually drew their power and their poisonous quality from the underworld itself. So that in itself is a really interesting belief right there. This also kind of contributes to the idea that venomous creatures got their venom from eating poisonous plants, and that venomous creatures could become more venomous by eating more poisonous plants or eating more venomous creatures. So we'll talk about a little bit later about some different magical poisons created in this way. But yeah, it was believed that that poison could be absorbed, through ingestion, and actually kind of absorb it as a power for these venomous creatures. And then to the left there, we have a little winged serpent, a dracante. Those were believed to guard frankincense trees. Chinese poison magic is important to look at, just sort of in building this concept, because I think it's one of the closest things to, a full-blown tradition of using poison as a magical tool that we really don't have in the Western world. So looking to them for some of the structure to sort of fill in the blanks with, some of the more native plants and imagery and concepts to a Western esoteric practice. But it's, sort of this concept again of life energy and death energy, or good chi and bad chi. So this poison energy is the energy of death. It's an energy that can be directed or cultivated or concentrated. And in Chinese, it is called gu. Gu is a legendary poison with magical properties. It's also the term for the practice in and of itself, this magical poison central practice. So it's the name for the substance as well as the practice. Gu was created by storing venomous creatures in a box. The idea was to create a super venom by allowing these venomous creatures to consume one another. And this would actually be extracted for love charms. It could be used for causing disease, killing from a distance, black magic. It's kind of an interesting duality there. On one hand, it's used for love charms. On the other hand, it's used for hexing and hurting people. But it was also used to sort of discriminate against minority women in the northern provinces of China during the time. So we see sort of a similar thing to what was going on in Europe of, this accusation of these women using these poisonous plants and doing all of these things and it not being good. In Chinese poison magic, there are 5 poisonous creatures. We can see depicted on this little coin here, which was used as a protective talisman. The creatures were viper, toad, scorpion, centipede, and spider. Sometimes you see the tiger instead, and that's what's on this coin here. But those 5 insects or reptiles, creatures, would be what would be used to create the gu poison. So combining those 5 creatures would create that super venom because they were seen as these auspicious sort of poison creatures representative of poison. They were seen as evil spirits, the spirit of the poison itself that would inhabit a vessel or a body. So it's kind of just acting as a spirit vessel for these harmful spirits that can then be directed by the practitioner. So it is also a word for a type of black magic, but then we have gudao, which is Taoist poison magic, and this kind of takes a slightly different approach. There's a really good video on this on YouTube by someone named Benabel Wen. If you just, I'll put it in the chat, Google that in YouTube. That's a really good video. Her background is in the Tao and Chinese witchcraft and things like that. So just to mention it because it is really interesting. But with Taoist poison magic, it's this concept of working with poison magic before you can move on to the more advanced healing practices. So that's kind of the same concept of you have to know how to harm somebody before you are able to heal them. When it comes to dosages and understanding, what is that lethal dose, kind of setting that up as a safeguard, working with some of these lower vibration energies before we can go on to more advanced like healing practices and things like that, which is the concept. So it can be protective and healing, or it can be harmful and malicious. Poison and protection magic. We're doing pretty good on time. I have an alarm set for about 20 minutes, like if anyone has any questions just for towards the end. However, no one has any questions, I will just keep talking. So it does have a protective quality. In the natural world, poison is used as a defense mechanism. So in this case, when we're using it for protective purposes, we're kind of fighting fire with fire. So adding different poisonous plants to protective formulas or protective boundaries or things like that is almost kind of the magical equivalent to dipping your arrow in poison. It's just kind of an extra layer, if you will. They can be used in strengthening boundaries because of that Saturnian quality. So Saturn is going to be all about enforcing those boundaries. It can be used in binding magic to restrict someone's actions from doing something harmful in one way or another, or for Saturnian protection. And Saturnian protection would be long-term protection. Something that you're wanting to build up over a longer period of time. The more Mars-oriented protection is going to be faster, it's going to be more fiery, it's going to be kind of real powerful, and then done really, really fast. But in this case, it's going to be built up over a longer period of time. Things like woody nightshade and deadly nightshade are great for this. Woody nightshade, it's been used in folk magic for protection throughout Europe for centuries, and it also has that vining quality to it too. So it's really great for laying boundaries or creating different wreaths and circles and things like that. And then with deadly nightshade, we've not only got that poison quality, but then also the association with battle magic through the goddess Bellona. It could be used to strengthen existing defenses or as a spell in and of itself. And that brings us to the concept of the poison jar. This is going to be very similar to a witch bottle, and it can be constructed in combination with a witch bottle, added to an existing witch bottle, or its own separate thing. But combining all of these different harmful ingredients with the same idea of them working in a protective way. So, thorn apple thorns. Of course, you're going to be careful putting things in the jar depending on what you're putting in there. But, the nastier that you can make it, generally, the better. But it still works on that same concept of adding nails and bits of glass and things like that. It's just more of a plant-based. Then we can go into more offensive magic. So this is, offensive protection magic or just offensive magic in general. poison energy can be contained for use in malefic magic. So this idea of sort of creating a concentrated sort of super venom as, a magical object meant to work as a hex or work as a curse in some way, whether it's to be left in a specific area or given to a specific person. There's really up to you different ways to employ it, but this energy that can kind of be collected. And I did mention earlier just the additional layer of damage or additional layer of protection in protection magic. It also will make your existing curses and hexes that much nastier. Thinking about the different symptoms that different plants cause, poppies for confusion, hemlock to kill sex drive, hellebore for mania, craziness, things like that. So start thinking along those lines, when you're adding these additional layers to your spells. So this type of offensive magic is going to be more stealthy and more secretive. Same as with the protection magic. We have that earthy Saturnian protection, fiery Mars protection. Same thing with the offensive magic. This is going to be the stuff that, sort of slithers its way in and undermines from inside. Same thing with the goofer dusts and poison powders or putting live things in you. These are both practices in American folk magic. Different powders with poisonous properties that will actually put these sort of spiritual parasites into a person. So there's that idea of infection there that's done through the feet. Hemlock, belladonna, hellebore, I think I mentioned a lot of these are great for offensive magic, and the creation of magical weapons as well. So magical weapons can be taken to the astral realm. Either can serve in sort of magical warfare, or more so as sort of a protective sort of a mechanism there. And then we go into the aphrodisiac, the love magic side of poison magic. Could I tell us more about Woody Nightshade? I can, yes. So Woody Nightshade is a member of the nightshade family. It's a common nightshade. It grows on a vine. It has red berries and purple flowers. Because it's a common nightshade, it's really good for just kind of general Saturnian workings. I know that's really, really vague sounding, but anything that's kind of witchy or malefic or related to the dead or the planet Saturn, Woody Nightshade is going to be great for. The scientific name is Dulcamara. Oops, don't type yet. I do have an article written on that as well that I'll refer you to. Let's get back to where I was. So intoxication. So the actual act of intoxication, we are introducing intoxicating substances into our body for a desirable effect. So this could be lowering inhibitions, raising passions, whether it's for sex magic, ecstatic trance, love magic, or just enjoying, the act of sex itself. Can be a spiritual experience. So using poisonous plants in formulations to influence and enchant. Like I mentioned, the glamour magic and seduction. Plants that are going to be good for this are going to be poppy, mandrake, henbane, belladonna. We see these used throughout the ancient world in different aphrodisiac formulas, formulas associated with fertility, sexuality. They're provocative. They help us kind of come into our own sexual power, you know, becoming more comfortable with aspects of our sexuality that are not maybe accepted by ourselves on a conscious level, and different things like that. The pocula amatoria, which is an ancient example of one of these preparations. This was a stupefying love potion. There's not really recipes that I could find on specific ingredients, but likely it was something that contained mandrake, poppy, henbane. Mandrake was infused into wine. It still is infused into wine as an aphrodisiac. And then the henbane oil, of course, used as an aphrodisiac massage oil. So whether you're, sort of employing the more entheogenic aphrodisiac effects or using them in love magic or sex magic, there's definitely that element of, aphrodisiac intoxication there with poison magic. I love incorporating belladonna into my commanding formulas and influence formulas. Those are some of my favorite ones to make. Just like a basic commanding formula: calamus root, licorice, bergamot, and then I'll create a separate blend with the belladonna and kind of bring the two together. So it's sort of an old world, new world collaboration. So this is going to be connected with spirits like Lilith, Babylon, Erzulie, Narcissus, Jezebel. And on the alternate side of the coin, we have anaphrodisiacs, so anti-love. This was an ability that was also attributed to the Thessalian witches. In addition to their ability to inspire love, they could also stop it. And like I mentioned earlier in the presentation, poison hemlock is one of the best and favorites for this. It's great for breakup spells, destroying sex drive. So this could be used supportive for sex addiction, healing sexual trauma, or even issues with boundaries. So it's really all about how you think about the plant and the energy and how you're kind of incorporating it into your situation, that they can kind of work one way or the other. You see to the left are just some little, these are like heart protective charms. We've got some rose hips, datura, iron nails. Made those a couple years ago. But poisons are generally going to be bitter. And this is kind of to our benefit because it makes it harder for us to poison ourselves because they're not sweet tasting, unless you're talking about belladonna, which has sweet berries, another indicator of that seductive quality. But because poisons are bitter ingredients are going to be used in anti-love workings. So using a couple candle, anointing it with hemlock oil, burning it through a breakup, surrounding the candle with dead roses instead of living roses, sort of in a means to help you sort of cut off from your emotions for a little bit, or keep yourself from hurting too much so that you can move on and move forward. It's a really great thing for that. And then we have poisonous projectiles. So this is a concept, again, of poison as an energy or a sort of a force that we're able to send. That's essentially what the evil eye is. It's a concentrated malefic energy that's able to cause physical damage. We also see this in different kinds of magical darts, elf shot, all of those sorts of things. The poison arrows and flying snakes. So there is poison in the air for sure. Doing it in this way, it can be used to destroy attachments, negative entities, and banish illness. So it's kind of weaponizing. One example would be an alcohol. was talking to my sister about this earlier in the week, which is kind of where the poisonous projectiles come in, and she was relating a story of being down in Ecuador and doing an ayahuasca ceremony, and the shamans using the alcohol to kind of bring the spirits out of them, and referring to it as a magical projectile. So the alcohol sort of acts as a vehicle for that shamanic force or that shamanic energy. That's then able to bring that spirit guide out, or it could also be used, alternately in dealing with illnesses, attachments, or unwanted entities as, kind of a spiritual weapon or a spiritual bullet. So that is an example of poison being used as a projectile. Incorporating other sorts of poisonous plants, imagery with poison blades, poison arrows, that sort of thing, kind of along the same concept, but you don't really get that physical effect of that actual movement of breath and energy and that concentration, with the alcohol. Other herbs could be incorporated into that, but because we're talking about poisonous plants, we'd have to be very, very careful, because the alcohol does go in your mouth. So in this case, the alcohol itself is the toxin. Poisonous plants are also vampiric. This is a really interesting little corner of magic that I've been wanting to explore for a few years now. Using different plants in ways for their ability to draw out or absorb energy. There's a number of different applications that this could apply to, from benefiting the psychic vampire community and establishing boundaries, and energetic exchange, and things like that, to providing people with the means to create energetic batteries to sort of supplement their needs when they're not being met any other way. So we have this concept of contraction, of drawing out and absorbing this energy. To be seen in the bitter, soporific, Saturnian nightshade herbs, and also in parasitic and carnivorous plants. So through their sympathy, the fact that they grow on a host or consume other living things, kind of adds to this sort of vampiric quality that they have about them. So these could be employed to sort of draw energy off of a specific person or a specific situation. If you're wanting something to not succeed, to take energy away from it, or to sort of supplement or improve your own sort of energetic output. Maybe you've been working too much and you need an extra source of energy. Plants like this can be incorporated into creating objects and artifacts that can facilitate that, and that's really interesting corner of magic that I'm exploring right now. Also looking at plants that cause respiratory paralysis, so hellebores, hemlock. This sort of taps into the strangler night hag aspect, which is sort of an early archetype to the vampire. The night hag, the lamia, the witch, we're all sort of wrapped up into one nocturnal creature at one time. So this is a vampiric witch prototype, connecting all of these three different concepts that really trace back to shamanic roots and shape shifting and things like that. Some other examples, we've got mistletoe, not typically what we would think of as something extremely dark. It was the only poisonous thing able to kill Balder. We've got the parasitic connection there, even though it's maybe more of a solar herb. Hellebine and convolvulus, those are all kind of binding parasitic bindweeds and things like that. And carrion flowers, those are also a really interesting sort of category. I mean, not necessarily in poison magic, but in some cases, flowers that will produce the scent of rotting meat through their alkaloids as they're broken down. This is a really interesting connection too, with the energies of death and things like that. Just having these carry-on flowers around, acting as sort of plant spirit allies. You're sort of getting a different consciousness, or a different, just a different sort of spiritual mindset when you're communicating with plants like these that are parasitic, or produce these death-like odors and things like that, than you would meditating with angelica or lavender or St. John's wort, or something it's going to have a very different consciousness. So the poison path in my case is all about exploring sort of those connections. It is 4:30. If anybody has any questions, feel free to ask them. We've got a few more slides left to go. I'm going to talk about some different protective charms and antidotes. So because poison was such a real threat in the ancient world, there are all of these different charms and antidotes and methods for avoiding poison and detecting poison, and even neutralizing it. So just kind of looking into that, we get an understanding of our knowledge of poison before modern toxicology, and how it was still very superstitious. And then in looking at these objects, we also kind of develop sort of a talismanic connection to poison magic through sympathy. So while a lot of these are used to neutralize poison or to warn against it, they are sort of a talismanic touchstone for that current of poison magic that I'm talking about, and could even be employed as protective charms to sort of warn or neutralize against other unwanted influences. Some of the charms are a little bit more fantastic than others, so I've just sort of listed those down at the bottom. Unicorn horn, which is actually a narwhal tusk from a sea creature. Bezoars, gastrointestinal stones from different animals, toadstones, hornbill spoons. So these are all coming from animal sources. Those were all believed to protect against and neutralize poison. The unicorn horns and bezoars in particular, they would go for large amounts of money, to where only royalty would be able to afford these things. And they're mainly the ones that were at risk for being poisoned. So it's good that they could afford it. So with hemlock oil, you're generally safe using it. I would normally do an infusion of dry. The question was with using hemlock as an anointing oil. Dry hemlock is always going to have less alkaloids than fresh hemlock, so I wouldn't recommend doing it with fresh. All of my anointing oils, I use the dry hemlock. And with that, it's going to be more of a an energetic sort of magical formulation anyway. You're not making it really concentrated. Yeah, and that kind of answers the next one. They do not need to be chemically or medicinally viable to be effective. Yeah, rotten things can be used. There's a what was it? Piss, pox, and poison. Every good witch knows they have their use. So we can use the rotten stuff for hexing, cursing. It's really open to your own creativity. But no, they don't need to be chemically viable or made to a really high concentration to be used in spell work. These are some of the most powerful plants on the earth. just the fact that they're in there is going to add to the magic of it. Good question. These are really, really interesting. They are adder's tongue credence tables, or Naderzungen Credenzen. They're made from what's called adder's tongue and red coral in this case, which you see depicted on the left. Adder's tongues were actually fossilized shark teeth, megalodon shark teeth, that were sold all across Europe during this time. They were worn as necklaces, they were dipped in beverages and things like that to neutralize poison. The ornamentation was actually believed to sweat or change color when it would be in the presence of anything poisonous. So these candelabra looking things would be placed on these tables in the dining area, and that's where we get the term credence table or credenza, because they were proving the credence or proving the truthfulness of all of the people at the dinner by being there. So oftentimes just the presence of one of these would be enough to deter a potential poisoner from applying their poison, because it's likely they would get caught. They were called glossopetra, which means stone tongue. So they were actually believed to be the petrified tongues of snakes. So it's this connection to the serpent, a venomous creature used as an apotropaic charm to actually protect from the same sort of venomous influence. And we see that with the snake stones as well. Snake stones are fossilized ammonite shells. So they're in a spiral shape. They were believed to be the petrified bodies of little snakes that would actually be worn to protect against poison. What forms do you prefer to use in this? I use a lot of oils personally when it comes to working with the plants. Definitely oils, in some cases plant matter. If I'm sort of building an altar space, or maybe like a kind of mandala or something like that, where I'll use different like intact parts of the plant. But really, if you can use it in any form that you want. I'm just a big fan of oils. A few minerals to talk about, anti-poison minerals. So magical weapons that can be taken into the astral realm real quick. Okay, I've got 20 minutes before this cuts off. Those would be ritually constructed weapons that would now be possible for them to, you're basically creating an astral double for an inanimate object through ritual that will allow you to take that object into the astral realm, for a variety of different shamanic purposes, whether it's using it in shamanic surgery for healing, or to destroy a negative entity or something like that. It's just an additional preparation that makes it so that weapon can be taken with you on that journey. Not that you wouldn't be able to do that without proper visualization, but you're essentially building sort of that astral vessel for the weapon to be effective on that plane. You're welcome. So some different minerals I mentioned with the Shiba eye agate. The agate was used to neutralize poison. It was made into cups that were believed to neutralize any toxin that was poured into it. They were also powdered and put on snake bites or drank as a cure. We'll see a lot of these minerals actually being powdered and taken in wine as an antidote for poison. The next one, emerald, which is actually very valued by Arab physicians for this effect. We have amethyst and jade. So a lot of people know amethyst is used to prevent intoxication. So chalices made from amethyst were thought to keep you from getting too drunk. But they're also used as anti-poison vessels, which, you know, intoxication essentially is poisoning. So it acts you to curb some of the toxic influence of whatever it's containing. There was terra sigillata. This was a mineral-rich clay that was used as an antidote in the ancient world that was actually proved to have different silicate particles that absorbed heavy metals, which was really interesting. You know, looking back on a lot of these ancient antidotes, a lot of them seem pretty fantastical and you know, just very superstitious. But with a few of them, there are some scientific you know, truths behind, you know, why they were doing what they were doing. Of course, a lot of these stones would be carved with different images of poisonous creatures, acting as apotropaic charms to protect from the same. And then we have the minerals buffonite and batrachite. So those are a form of toadstone. Toadstone was a mineral coveted by royalty and nobility. It's made into cute little rings. Toadstone comes from a couple of different sources. There's the zoological source, which is actually the fossilized tooth of a prehistoric sea creature called a lepidote. They just look like little brown buttons. That's what you'll typically see in medieval poison rings. And then we also have buffonite, which is a mineral that somewhat resembles an amphibious or, you know, reptilian kind of a skin texture color. So those are a little bit easier to find. Those are also referred to as toadstone. Toadstone is interesting because toads are also associated with witches. Toads are also very much connected to the devil. We have the toad bone rite. So I kind of see the toadstone as really like representative of that sort of toad witch, you know, diabolical pact kind of process. So that's why I like the toadstone. Interestingly, we see a lot of these minerals as being fossils. And when we look at the chemical analysis of the fossils themselves, you know, being powdered and put into a beverage and drank as an antidote, they contain calcium carbonate. And calcium carbonate will actually help to absorb different poisons from the body. I think it works through chelating, but don't quote me on that. So it's, you know, these fossils that they thought were, you know, little stone snakes actually contain this substance that really does, you know, neutralize poisons in the body when taken internally. So that's a really interesting kind of connection too. So just in conclusion, we see that poison has played a very prominent role on the progression of human history, from religion, medicine, criminology, toxicology, and spirituality. And throughout that entire time, it's been inextricably linked to magic and witchcraft. You know, I see the poisonous plants, the poison path, the poisonous herbs, they're all just potentiators. They are allies. You know, if you're the left-hand path, you know, goetic, dark herbalist, occultist kind of a practitioner, you know, these are your energetic allies. You know, it's not surprising that somebody that practices those types of things would resonate more with different, you know, plants like these as opposed to, you know, more healing, more celestial ones. So I think there's much more to the poison path and the practice of poison magic that is yet to be uncovered, because we are really just getting a lot of this information back. You know, pretty much been wiped from human consciousness for the past few hundred years. But we can use it to carry magical intention. all different sorts of ways to employ it in your magical practices. If you come up with something that you think is really creative or innovative and you'd like to let me know about it, I would love, love, love to hear about that. I am working on putting together a collection of poison anthologies that's in very, very early stages. So anything that you guys kind of come up with, you know, based on this class. Hopefully I gave you some different mythological, symbolic, sympathetic associations to kind of run with. And if no one else has any other questions, I will close it out. Yeah, that video is totally amazing. I know there's some obscure books like the Thai occult book and things like that on it, but I'm just not familiar enough with that area. So yeah, thepoisonersapothecary@gmail.com if you have any questions. Again, thank you guys so much for attending. If you'd like the transcript, please make sure that you email me. And have a good rest of your weekend.